The Youngers and Pitts, hunkered in the thickets, could hear the excited shouts and whoops of the manhunters closing in, like the high-pitched howls of hounds nearing the end of the chase. The outlaws were simply too exhausted to run again. "Cole, we are entirely surrounded. There is no hope of escape," Pitts said. "We had better surrender." Cole looked at his old friend Pitts and called him by his real name. "Sam," Cole said grimly, "if you want to go out and surrender, go on. This is where Cole Younger dies." "All right, Captain," Pitts said. "I can die just as game as you can. Let's get it done." To flush the fugitives, Sheriff Glispin turned to 39-year-old Captain William W. Murphy, who had arrived with several men from his farm 4 miles away. Murphy, a veteran of the 14th Pennsylvania Cavalry, had been wounded 3 times in battle, and had also spent time in a Confederate prison camp. His Civil War heroics were well known, and Murphy fully lived up to his reputation, immediately calling for volunteers to accompany him into the brush to root out the robbers. The outlaws froze in place as they listened to Captain Murphy's call for men. They instantly looked at one another, and then hurriedly pulled out all their revolvers, spinning the cylinders of each one to make sure every chamber contained a live round. Cole spoke in a whisper. "Make for the horses. Every man for himself. There's no use stopping to pick up a comrade here, or we can't get him through the line. Just charge them and make it if we can." 6 men volunteered to join Captain Murphy, including Sheriff Glispin and Colonel Vaught. Others were called to join the 7, but not a sound came from the remaining possemen, so Captain Murphy organized his brave handful in a skirmish line, each man 5 feet from the next. "Do not shoot first," he instructed his men, as he intended to call out to the fugitives to surrender once he knew their location. Captain Murphy now gave the command to march, and the line slowly advanced north, pushing through thick willows about 5 feet high. Charlie Pitts, crouching in the willows with his comrades, spotted Sheriff Glispin coming toward him, and when the sheriff approached to about 15 feet, Pitts jumped up and aimed his revolver at the sheriff. Glispin, who held a single-shot rifle at the ready, saw the huge outlaw rise from the willows and quickly drew a bead on him. Both men fired almost simultaneously. Pitts fell forward like a brick and rolled over upon his back dead. Glispin, unharmed, dropped to one knee to reload, as the younger brothers stood up and furiously fired their pistols, flame and smoke belching from the barrels. The manhunters instantly returned fire on the outlaws, a spray of lead flying through the brush. Across the river, several trigger-happy possemen blazed away into the willows, their bullets snipping twigs perilously close to Murphy's men. Captain Murphy fired all 6 chambers of his revolver and yelled over to Glispin that he needed to reload. The sheriff yanked his own loaded pistol from its holster and tossed it to Murphy. The captain began to move even closer forward, but then he suddenly jumped back when one of the outlaw's balls slammed into the right side of his stomach. He immediately reached down, expecting to feel blood soaking his clothing, but instead felt his large briarwood pipe, now splintered, in his vest pocket. Later, when he pulled back his vest and shirt, all he could find was a slight bruise. The Youngers were getting the worst of it, taking hits from all directions. Jim winced in pain as a ball pierced his right thigh. Then his head snapped back as one of Colonel Vaught's bullets tore into the left side of his upper jaw and lodged in the roof of his mouth near the back of the throat. He fell to the ground unconscious, blood gushing from his face. Buckshot peppered Cole's head and back, causing him to grunt and suck in air. Next, a ball penetrated his head behind his right eye. He collapsed near his brother, bleeding from his nose and mouth. Bob took a bullet in the right lung but remained standing, an empty revolver in his left hand. His elbow injury rendered him helpless to reload his pistol. With the outlaws' guns silent, Captain Murphy shouted for a ceasefire and demanded that the fugitives surrender. "Do not shoot any more," Bob Younger answered, as the boys were riddled. "Throw up your hands," ordered Sheriff Glispin. Bob held up his left hand. "Throw up the other." Bob explained that his other arm was broken, and Glispin told him to move to Captain Murphy and turn over his weapon. As Bob stepped forward, he came onto higher ground and was suddenly visible to the possemen across the river. One fired at Younger, striking him under his arm and causing a flesh wound. Bob halted, angrily shouting, "Some damn son of a bitch shot me after I surrendered." Murphy yelled again for all the men to cease fire. "Don't shoot him or I'll shoot you," Sheriff Glispin added for good measure. Bob then advanced to Murphy and handed him his pistol. The other skirmishers converged on Murphy and Glispin, and all the men farther out began pouring into the willows to get a look at the defeated Northfield robbers. They heard the moans of Cole and Jim before they saw them on the ground. Jim sputtered and hacked, strangling on clots of his own blood. He pointed to his mouth as the possemen crowded around him. 33-year-old John M. Robb of Medelia kneeled down and ran his finger between Jim's lips and cleared his mouth, causing the panic in Jim's face to fade away. Robb then told Jim to get up. "They'll shoot me," Jim slurred. "No," said Robb. "You have surrendered, and I will stand between you and harm." Jim stood up, unbuckled his ammunition belt, and handed it and his loaded Smith & Wesson to Robb. He had tossed aside his other revolver after emptying it in the fight, although it was quickly recovered. The souvenir seeking started almost immediately. Sheriff Glispin called for a wagon to transport his prisoners and Pitts's corpse to Medelia. Cole, 8 fresh wounds in his body, not counting those from Northfield, slowly stood, and along with Jim and Bob was marched out of the willows to a place where the wagon could pull up. Several men dragged Pitts's body out of the brush by its feet. Colonel Vaught walked up to Cole and instantly recognized him as the pleasant Southern man who had lodged at his hotel under the name J.C. King. "He recognized me," Vaught remembered, and held out his blood-covered hand and shook my hand and called me landlord. Captain Murphy could not help but feel compassion for the pathetic-looking fugitives, with their soiled and torn clothing, worn-out boots, and multiple bloody wounds. They were suffering incredible pain. After a moment of silence, Murphy spoke up. "Boys, this is horrible, but you see what lawlessness has brought to you." There were those who felt no sympathy at all, some, including several possemen who had remained silent when the call went out for volunteers to go in after the outlaws, clamored for killing the youngers. With a disgusted look on his face, Sheriff Glispin put a quick stop to such talk. Oscar Sorbel, who had been relegated to holding some of the possemen's horses during the capture, came up as the wagon arrived and helped load Pitts's body. Once the youngers were aboard, Bob asked if he could have a chew of tobacco. Several men said he did not deserve any, but Oscar found a man who was willing to give up a 10-cent plug, and he handed it to the outlaw. Bob broke off half with his teeth and began to return the other half to Oscar, but the young man told him to keep it. The wagon lumbered out of the Watonwan bottom and halted briefly on the bluff to the south. Glispin needed to rearrange his prisoners to make them more comfortable for the ride of several miles into town. Cole and Jim were in such bad shape they looked like they might die before getting to Medelia. At approximately 5 p.m., Sheriff Glispin's posse with its grizzled trophies pulled up at the end of Medelia's main street. A large crowd, made even bigger by a special train from Mankato, had arrived at the site of the cavalcade. Many stood in buggies and wagons to get a better view. As the prisoner's wagon passed down the street, huzzas went up as each throng got its first good look at the outlaw brothers. Despite their exhaustion and aching injuries, the youngers suddenly became alert, marveling at the crowd and reveling in the attention. Jim, blood dripping from his face in clotted masses, waved his hat back and forth, and even managed to let out a cheer or two. Cole, his right eye now swollen shut, waved his hand and took a gentlemanly bow. 23-year-old Luther Pomeroy never forgot the sight. "Cole may have been an outlaw," he said years later, "but many of us that day admired his nerve, for he was a man who could take it on the chin and still smile."